But actually, it's not. What are your thoughts on that?
The whole conversation and the whole book is so counterintuitive. It's like a giant paradox, where on the surface it's like, wait a minute, what? Yeah. Again, it's one of those things you think about it and you go, yeah, of course. In the middle of difficult times, hard times, things that create unhappiness or negative feelings, we think, well, these are the very things I'm trying to avoid. And he makes the point, those are the very things that lead to happier. And he makes this distinction between happy and happier.
Yeah.
That the goal isn't happy because what even is that, right? The goal is happier. Wherever you are now, there's a way to be happier.
So yeah, he even said in the book, Oprah calls it happierness.
Yeah, happierness. Yeah, so happierness or happier is all about being honest with the negative feelings we have that are based on negative circumstances, whether it's something that happened at work in a minute or something that means, oh no, I've got to look for a job, or oh no, I've got to look for a doctor, whatever it might be. And learning or creating the discipline of stepping back from our emotions and gaining just enough objectivity to where we can bring a thought process to our emotions rather than being controlled by our emotions. Because as long as we're controlled by our emotions, his point is, we're going to be unhappy because negative emotions trigger a sense of unhappiness.
Right.
And for me, one of the big takeaways in the book, and then he explored this a little bit in our conversation, was the whole idea of sort of asking the question, what would I tell someone else if this had happened to them?
Mm-hmm.
Because immediately it brings the entire event, again, whether it's something that happened at work or something that represents a life change, something that happened to a child or you flunked out of school, whatever it might be. Suddenly it takes me out of the emotional context of what happened into the more objective. Context of what would I say to someone? What would I tell them? How would I encourage them? What would I suggest they do next? And just that exercise, which is not intuitive, it is so helpful. And I think everybody listening to some extent has done that at some level. We've certainly all given other people advice when they've had a terrible time. And for those of us as parents, when your 12-year-old or 13-year-old comes to you with some event that's the end of the world, their life is over. I can't ever go back to school.
Can't ever show my face again.
I can't write.
Yeah.
And as adults, we're kind of like, what?
You're fine.
Right, because we have so much objectivity and we have distance and we're not having to navigate their feelings because those aren't our feelings. That sense of separation, again, he says that is the path forward in terms of finding the objectivity we need, not just to respond correctly to a negative event, but ultimately this leads to happier because in the moment we are not happy. But then he makes the point in the book and in the discussion that this discipline is how anyone can become happier. And as we've talked about before, happy is a result. Happy is not a target. And the person who just decides I'm going to chase happiness, it's kind of a doom loop.
They're not going to find it.
No, well, you're chasing your tail. You're chasing the wind. You're going to go from experience to experience, person to person, because happiness is tied to purpose, and purpose has everything to do with how we respond oftentimes to negative event. It's not intuitive, but it's so powerful, and it's so true. And, for our podcast listeners, whether, the marketplace, there's always negative stuff. There are always problems to solve. The problems never go away. I mean, as long as there's people, and again, whether the problems are the result of downturn in the market or the product sales or whatever you're doing, or, with success comes challenges as well. Without this discipline, we can become a victim of our own emotions. And even if we like or love what we do, it's easy to not love our life or love the person in the mirror. So this discipline, this metacognition he talks about thinking, that's what that actually means. it is so important. So anyway.
Well, and especially in the workplace, I mean, not only does, it help you reflect on, okay, what's really happening? What advice would I give? But it also in the workplace prevents you from saying something stupid to somebody.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, it really prevents you from...
One less trip to HR.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And I think, Arthur was making that point of it allows you to create distance before you respond to the person in front of you so that you can go, wait, if I say what's actually in my head, things are not going to go well for me.
Even if I'm right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
There's certain contexts that you have to control.
Yep.
But metacognition gives you those tools to do that. I mean, it's super important at home, but it's also super important in the workplace.
Yeah.
So one of the other things I thought was interesting from the book, we didn't talk about it with Arthur in our podcast interview, but there's actually a quiz that helps us uncover our unique mix of happiness and unhappiness. And he says it's important to know your starting point. Like you need to know what your natural bend is, because for people with different bends, every quadrant that he identifies has a positive and a negative, and knowing what your natural bend is going to help you in applying these metacognition principles. And the 4 quadrants he identifies is a cheerleader, a mad scientist, a judge, and a poet. And did you take the quiz, and what did you get?
Well, I wanted to be the mad scientist because that sounded like the most interesting one. And I think I took the quiz wrong, Susie, and so don't laugh, because I scored as a cheerleader and no one around here considers me a cheerleader. And you scored as a cheerleader. I
did.
And we could not be more different in some ways. That's why we get along and work well together. So I think actually reading the descriptions of these 4 after I took the test incorrectly is maybe judge, because I definitely don't avoid bad news. In fact, I tend to gravitate toward bad news because I think, oh, there's the problem, I'm going to go fix it. That's why the mad scientist thing appealed to me. But yet, I think I came out as a judge. And to the point of the book and the point of the discussion, knowing what quadrant we're in allows us to evaluate our feelings and find the path forward to distancing ourselves from those negative emotions, gaining objectivity, and moving forward. So it really is a helpful exercise, even though I didn't score myself correctly.
Well, and I do think you're right.
So tell us what it's like to be a cheerleader. In fact, when I met you, you were a cheerleader.
I was a cheerleader in high school.
Yeah.
It's very true. Well, no, my husband says I'm not the glass is half full. He says the glass is overflowing, because it's like, it's all going to be fine. It's all going to be great. But a blind spot as a cheerleader is during life's gloomier times, I tend to try to be like, hey, let's just figure this out. It's going to be fine. Both these options are great. Let's move forward. I tend to probably gloss over, especially how people are feeling. I know I probably do this. At work, but I definitely do this at home, and had to really realize for my kids that are not this personality type or not in this quadrant, to go, I need to slow down during gloomier times and not try to immediately fix it.
And how does that relate to happier for you?
Well, for me, the happier slowing down, because for me it's easier just to be like, hey, we're good, we're gone, everything's fine, let's move. But it actually is better relationally for the family and at work for me to slow down, because then everybody gets on the same playing field, and ultimately it makes us move forward together versus me be like, come on, let's go.
Yeah. And so if I can just unpack your situation for a minute, because it's easier than unpacking mine and be comfortable. So what happens is, and to the point of the book, why this is such an important topic, if you don't distance yourself from your everything's fine, the sun is always shining, if you don't recognize those feelings, even though they're good feelings, and get objectivity, it results in insensitivity to the people in your family who aren't wired that way, or the people at work who aren't wired that way.
Right.
And things don't go well, and so you're not going to be happier because somehow your sunshine isn't moving things forward, because sunshine alone doesn't do it.
That's right.
As the judge, where I want to go in and make everything right, and I want to fix everything, and I want to fix everything immediately, and not everything can be fixed, and most things can't be fixed immediately, and that frustrates me because I want it to work right now. Even at home, if the internet isn't working, I don't care what else is going on. I'm going to stop and work on it
right then.
All night. Right, because I mean, Sandra would tell you, Andy wants things to work, and he wants them to work now. When something doesn't work, I just stop. I have to go make it work. Well, that's a positive in a way, but when I catch myself being that way, separate myself from that false sense of urgency where I've made something a bigger deal than it actually
needs
is,
to be.
then I'm happier and I'm responding better to the people around me. So again, it's that discipline of pulling back and realizing that's my tendency, you have a tendency, and then he talks about these other two. And again, it's so powerful because we all know people who are just stuck in their emotions, and we wonder why are you so stuck in your emotions? They tell us a story and their emotions are 100% justified,
right,
but they're still stuck.
They're still stuck.
And then there are other people who have worse things happen to them, and somehow they're able to gain objectivity, leverage the negative for something positive, and move forward.
That's right.
And that's what this book is about. That way we don't stay stuck, because bad things are going to happen. in the podcast, because he teaches graduate students at Harvard, he reminds all of them, hey, the worst thing that's going to happen to you hasn't happened yet. If you think what's going on right now is bad, you just wait. The worst thing's coming. He says, so you got to exercise this muscle, this objectivity muscle. So when something else happens that's worse, you know how to step back, gain objectivity, leverage it, and move forward. So it's an important discipline.
For sure. All right, changing gears. Once we recognize the macro ingredients to becoming a happier person or leader and our natural bend, we're ready to discover the 4 pillars of happiness, which Arthur identifies as family, friendship, work, and faith.
Yep.
What stands out to you among those 4?
Well, and I confessed this in my discussion with him, that I have more what he calls deal friends than real friends. That was very convicting to me. It wasn't a new revelation, because Sandra and I talk about this. She's like, you need some friends? I'm like, I have friends. She goes, no, you have people you work with. I'm like, we're friends, but I know better, because I tell people, no, you're friendly, but friends, if somebody needs you, there's not equity in the relationship. No matter how well you get along, there's an inequity. And with friendship, nobody's leveraging the other person. That's a deal friend.
Right.
So that was convicting to me. But at the same time, when I'm with my friends, there is a replenishing thing that happens that everybody with true friends understands. You can sit for hours, talk for hours. Nobody's rushed. You can be wide open. There's no fear. There's nothing to gain. There's nothing to lose. And it is so replenishing. And to the point of this book and this discipline he talks about, I have experienced, once he kind of gave us language, that it is easier sometimes in a conversation with a friend to gain objectivity around my own emotions than either in my own head trying to do it, or even with people who want something or need something from me, because I'm always a little bit on my guard. But it's a friend that can say, hey, Andy, you just need to get over that.
Yeah, stop worrying about that.
Hey, Andy, what? So tell me why that's a big deal? Really? I mean, those kinds of people, true friends can draw us out because it's safe. And again, it sets us up to be happier, to learn from the negative and move forward. So that for me. So what about you, of the 4 pillars? Which one?
Well, I definitely will say on New Year's Eve, I actually read my family part of his chapter on family.
Out loud?
Out loud.
To your family?
To my family.
Wow.
Yeah. So I would say that's probably helpful, because I've got 2.
Were they happier after that?
They were certainly happier.
No, they weren't.
Yeah. I was happier. No, really, it's so super helpful, because I've got 2 young adult kids and 2 high school age kids. And I loved what Arthur said, that conflict is the cost of abundant love.
Yeah, say that again. That's
conflict is the cost of abundant love.
Wow.
And we've got a lot of kids going in different directions or very different personality types. And sometimes I just want, because I'm a cheerleader, I just want, listen, can't we just all get along?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like, can't you just honor her in this? Can't you just, but the idea that the cost of abundant love, the cost of loving each other uniquely, is going to be conflict. And then he unpacks that chapter on how do you manage that conflict.
Yep.
So super helpful. He said, in fact, in one point, siblings can fail to support each other in any number of ways. Mm. And I almost think that gave the 4 kids a chance to go,
yeah, this is normal.
This is normal.
But we can, but
we can get
it's
better.
Not right. It's not the end of the world. This is normal. How do we build and go forward? That is, wow.
So that's why I read it, not just because I was trying to tell them to do something, but just of like, hey, this is normal. There's ways forward. Mm-hmm. And
if we respond,
that's right,
the right way.
If we respond and not just ignore it. Mm. So I thought that in particular in the season of life I'm in, I found that extraordinarily helpful. But zeroing in on work, because I mean, this is a leadership podcast. I loved what Arthur said in the book, that engaging in work with your whole heart is one of the best ways to enjoy your days, get satisfaction from your accomplishments, and see meaning in your effort. Yep. He says, work at its best is love made visible. And for me, because I use the word love a lot in my regular speech, it spoke really deeply to me, the idea that work at its best is love made visible. How did it hit you?
Well, I certainly didn't have that terminology, but I think anybody who has meaningful work or does meaningful work gets that immediately, love made visible. And I'm fortunate because except for my first job, cleaning the meat department after hours at a grocery store, except for that one.
So fun.
Except for that one, I've always enjoyed my jobs. And there were enjoyable parts of that, but I don't remember them because they were so few and far between. But the point being, because other than that job, I have had great jobs, even in college, where it really was easy to engage with my whole heart. But I've learned too much of a good thing can make it a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. So the win is to enjoy going to work. And we've talked about this in the podcast before, to enjoy going to work and then to enjoy or to look forward to going back home and then getting up the next day and then look forward to enjoy going to work and then look forward to coming back home.
Yep.
That rhythm fuels happiness for me, joy for me. And so for the person that's stuck in a job they hate or they don't look forward to going home because there's so much chaos at home, that to me just sounds like the formula for misery. Again, it's a self-perpetuating problem. I'm going to stay longer at work because I enjoy work, which creates more problems at home because I need to be home, but I don't want to go home because there's so much chaos, so I'll stay at work and enjoy anyway, and round we go. So I've been very...
And rewards at work are so much more visible sometimes.
They're immediate, and they're visible, and there's dollars, and, you know...
Measurable.
And especially when you're the boss, everybody thinks your jokes are funny, and you're just the greatest person. So there's a false sense of importance and a false sense sometimes of success. So I've always had meaningful work except for the one job, and I enjoy going home. And I think anybody listening to try to find that rhythm.
So
and
true.
if that means doing a little extra work at home, you know, with the dynamics at home, you got to do it. If it means finding something else to do with your career, sometimes that's part of it as well. But anyway, that was what came to mind when I saw that section of the book. So, and of course, I've written a whole book on this, when work and family collide, because work and family oftentimes collide, but there is a way to find a rhythm, and it's worth working toward. And again, to the point of the book, for the person listening who says, well, I don't have that rhythm, and it's just mostly collide, and I don't enjoy going home, or maybe I don't enjoy going to work, but that creates problems at home, then that is a tension, and that is the kinds of thing that Arthur talks about that can be leveraged if we can step back, not be absorbed by and controlled by those negative emotions to find the way forward.
Yeah.
So again, this formula works in any context.
Well, I think that's so true. And I feel like in my own life, I was in telecom, as you know, for a decade before I came here. And the reason I was like, hey, this is not going to work for my life is I never, ever, ever saw my kids. Like never. I mean, I was in a role that I would probably get home and they were up 30 minutes and they would be in bed and I'd leave at 5 a.m. the next morning and do it all again. And realizing, hey, there's a conflict. And what I the picture that I want for my family, I'm not going to get there with this type of environment. And I liked it generally, but it wasn't meaningful. And so that's when I made the switch 20 years ago. So I feel like it's so true that figuring out how do you find that balance where you get so much meaning going to work, but then you're excited to go home because you've invested in the relationships and they're strong. So,
and again, you just illustrated part of what Arthur's talking about, because that negative experience with work and the overbearing schedule and the people associated with that schedule, that was negative, but you were able to leverage that negative experience to create something positive. That's what healthy people do. And that's apparently possible in any experience or any negative experience if we have, again, the discipline to step back and not just be angry all the time. Because you could have just been angry all the time at work and got fired, right? I mean, you could have been so controlled by those negative emotions, but you were too smart for that. And I'm glad you left and came here.
Me too. Well, I feel I'm a better leader and overall human after engaging with this research and this idea of putting those practical language around how do you step back and what are some practical ways to do it. How has it impacted you in terms of your practical day-to-day knowing these tools?
Well, I think it confirms a lot of things that we talk about on the podcast all the time. But it offers us fresh language and insight.
Yeah.
And the bottom line, and he says this in the book, that we can't change the world around us, but we can change ourselves in response to the world around us. And as I mentioned on the podcast, when I teach this kind of thing, I talk about the fact that we all have a superpower, and the superpower is our respond ability, that we do not have to react.
Yeah.
And in reaction mode, I'm going to stay unhappy and get unhappier. In response mode, I realize, I can separate myself from my emotions enough to choose the best response, or to what we talked about earlier, I can separate myself from my emotions enough to counsel myself to do what I would counsel my best friend to do if they were experiencing what I'm experiencing, and then respond accordingly. And if we leverage that superpower, then the negatives in life oftentimes make us better, make us stronger. And even if we can't completely escape circumstances or escape what's happening around us currently, we can at least find a path forward that hopefully will lead us to a better place. But again, at the end of the day, it's up to how well we lead the person in the mirror, as we talk about all the time.
Yeah, because these principles and practices allow us to take agency over our own life.
Yes.
We're not victims. We don't have
We're
to go
not
with the flow.
victims. No, that's exactly right. And that's the difference between the person who is destroyed by the negative versus the person that leverages the negative, and it's just a story they tell sometime in the future.
So true. So true.